Hey, TJI listeners, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and now YouTube.
Please like us, subscribe, and leave some comments. We want to know what you like, what you want to hear more about, where we're going.
It's a bit after 9 o'clock now, and we're still 3 hours away from Afghanistan. The terrorist cell in the Philippines was operating in the early 1990s, the very same time that Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were plotting to blow up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. The Pakistan government says it has closed its borders, but this territory is so vast and porous that almost anybody can slip through: refugees, Taliban, even Al-Qaeda members. In Islamabad, I'm Steve Narisi, CBS 11.
Okay, on today's podcast, we have a very, very special guest, a man of many talents and adventures, Mr. Steve Narisi.
Good to have you on, Steve.
Rich, how are you? Man, it's been a long time. When we were in Dallas together, for like 20 years or something like that.
Oh, yeah. I used to see you on the road a lot. Of course, you were usually working for the networks and stuff, but we always like to start these things with, I know you're part of that Arkansas mafia that took over Channel 4 back in the day, with all those great photographers that came out of Little Rock. And so we would run into you on social occasions too. But tell me about Steve Narisi, starting with when young Steve decided he wanted to be in TV news.
Well, I had an impression of news early on. I was in the 9th grade. A tornado hit a neighboring town, and my high school, St. Anne's Academy, sent people down to help out. And I walked in the middle of this disaster zone, this tornado. People were killed and sirens were blaring. There was pieces of houses and buildings everywhere. And I said, God, this is kind of fun. It kind of got in my blood. And, I mean, I know it's kind of shit, but I mean, because it was such an interesting experience to be out in the field and see something normal people didn't see. And it was exciting. And so it kind of got in my blood when I was in the 9th grade. And then I had an older brother who was also in the business, and he was the first to work in TV station before me. And he always came home from work with a smile on his face. He's having so much fun. So I said, I'm going to try this. And so I started off at a UHF station in Fort Smith, Arkansas, my hometown, Channel 40. And I started off, mopping floors, running studio camera, processing film, doing anything the newsroom wanted me to do. And I got hooked at that moment. I mean, it was just like I had these really interesting and colorful mentors, and you got to see the inside of the world. I said, this is something I'm going to do the rest of my life.
Well, and Bryan and I never really came at the business from where you came at it, because eventually you would become a network field producer and then an independent field producer and stuff. But just take us through the how that evolved, because I'm sure you probably didn't know exactly where you were going when you started out.
Well, none of this was planned, Rich. I don't know about you guys, but it just happened.
That's kind of the theme we're getting from everybody.
Yeah, it's like an accident, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to Phil Fleming, one of your colleagues. He says, well, I kind of started off wanting to be an actor, and all of a sudden I'm a TV photographer. So it's in all of our careers, we have these paths that go back and forth and zigzag, but I think they all come back to the same place. But I worked in, like a local market television, Fort Smith. I worked in Tulsa. I worked in Little Rock. And from Little Rock, I bounced down to network. But in Little Rock, I was on the air. I was a reporter the first part of my career. I covered a guy named Bill Clinton when he was governor.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, when he's running for governor. I covered him when he ran for Congress and lost. But I covered politics in Little Rock, and I also produced a newscast for 6 years. And so I was looking for something different. I wanted to do, I'm not sure what exactly I wanted to do. And an old buddy of mine, another part of the Little Rock Mafia, which I call Arco-Americans. We all came down. There was like a bunch of. So Bob Elliott was my roommate, and he was he worked at your station in Dallas, and then he went to be a correspondent in Houston at the Southwest Bureau for NBC News. He was a roommate, a really good friend. He said, Steve, you should come down and freelance for NBC. I mean, I'll introduce you to the bureau chief, and if you hit it off, then you can work part-time as a freelancer. I said, I'm looking for something new. So I moved down on a wish, pretty much. And I started freelancing and covering hurricanes and you name it, I was covering it. And so I was at network. So I jumped from Little Rock, Arkansas as a reporter and producer to a producer with the Southwest Bureau for NBC. So I was a freelancer, and jobs are very hard to get then, and to staff jobs. And so I was one of my beats was covering the space shuttle. And so I remember about a month before they were going to hire somebody new, but it's going to be a New York guy because that's how it worked with the networks. Yeah, I'm guessing someone from New York. Yeah,
can't have somebody from Arkansas, right?
Yeah, it's like it's I don't know. It's kind of like they have their own kind of mafia system up there too. Gurus and godfathers. And so I was really disappointed. My bureau chief said, "Steve, we love you. Can't put you on staff. We'll still work you." I said, "Greg, I'll still do this." So about 2 or 3 weeks later, the Challenger space shuttle exploded. And this was my beat. And all of a sudden, all these people came down from New York. He had Tom Brokaw and his producer. He had a vice president, people from Los Angeles, people from Miami and Atlanta. And, that story was huge. That was probably the biggest story since the Kennedy assassination. And I was covered internationally. And so I worked a week with all these New York people and from other parts of the country as well. And apparently I did something right. Well, we got something on the air every day. I was working with Don Oliver, another really great correspondent. And 2 weeks after everybody went back, I got called back to my bureau chief's office. He said, "Steve, job is yours." And that's how I got on board.
Just based on your performance covering that
My
story.
performance. And I have to give credit to news director in Little Rock, Gary Long. He wasn't the nicest man on the earth. There was no even relations departments back then. But I learned so much from that guy, as we all did. And so he taught me how to cover news. I was pretty good to begin with, but he just, he instilled me the spirit of journalism, and this is how you cover it. And you have to look at things this way. And so I learned so much from that newsroom in Little Rock that I was able to make that jump.
So this is a broad question, but how do you cover news? What does that mean?
Well, it's just you go in with your eyes wide open and and listen. And so a lot of stories are different, but a lot are the same. But even if the story is the same you covered before, you still have to go in with a fresh look because there can be some nuances you didn't see before. So the thing is, you talk to people, you get their stories, you listen with an open mind, you put your prejudices to one side, and just be a professional. And you call things as you see them, and not as what a producer wants you to say, or an anchor or a reporter wants you to say, or a political party wants you to say. You cover it as what it is actually that you interpret through your experience and also through your training.
So that reminds me of a line I heard. You see the world as it is, not how you wish it to be.
Good line.
Exactly. It's a very good line. And also kind of another line I like is you don't give people the viewers what they want. You give them what they need. And it's the same sort of philosophy. And you do your best job. You let the chips fall where they may. And I always tell people the stories I'm most proud of are the ones where I get called complaints from both sides because they both think I'm slanted.
True
and they're
enough.
from the opposite ends of the spectrum.
I had that experience many times. Often if you're covering the abortion issue, for example, I always thought the same thing. Man, both sides are hollering at me. I must have been somewhere down the middle.
Yeah, and sometimes that's really hard to do because you're raised a certain way. We have the certain lens we carry throughout our lives. But as a journalist, you learn to put that aside, and you have to go with what you see and give both sides of the story.
Okay, so you've got the staff job as a field producer in the bureau in Houston. How long did that last? And I'm guessing that took you all over the country, maybe all over the world.
Well, we had our region. It's kind of like zone defense in football. Our region was Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Texas, and northern Mexico, which is a huge chunk of geography.
That's a lot of territory
there. And I was on the road all the time. I remember back in those days, Southwest Airlines gave you a free companion pass after you've flown 100 times. And I think I got that pass in about 2 months. It seemed like though, because if you fly someplace, you have to fly back, so it's like twice, right? We were on the road all the time. Our feet never touched the ground. We had 2 producers in the bureau, and it seemed the other guy who had a lot of seniority was always on vacation. He had a lot of time built up, so it was just me. And a lot of times it was Bob Elliott, my old roommate. And but I got to work with some great crews, and so we would go. We'd fly to El Paso, which is another time zone, as you know, and that's how far away. And we get calls from New York. Can you run over to El Paso and do this story? And we said, well, you realize that El Paso is closer to Los Angeles than it is to Houston, But to them, it was only 3 inches on the map, right? So it was always on the road and tight deadlines, all hours of the day and night. I think at one point I worked like 42 days straight. I worked one time like 46 hours straight. You never knew what was going to happen because every story you covered would be a lead story, like at a local newscast, like once every 2 months, right? And these are national stories. So you had like the lead story essentially every day that you produced a story. And you never knew what it was going to be. There's a lot of natural disasters, a lot of hurricanes, or occasional earthquake down in Mexico. There would be baby Jessica, the little girl in the well. You had a mass murder in Arkansas. I mean, you never knew what the story was going to be. A riot at the Oklahoma Penitentiary in McAllister, and so you'd be up all night a lot of times because once you did file the nightly news report, you had to turn around and redo that story with additional information for the Today Show, which also often included a live shot. So, it was, we didn't get much sleep back then.
Were you on salary or were you getting overtime for some of this?
Unfortunately, I was on salary.
Yeah, that's the killer.
If I weren't on salary, I would have retired a long time ago. No, it was back then. The way it worked, the union towns, they called them the donut cities, like Philadelphia, New York, Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles. Those were union cities. So producers were on overtime. They were on part of the NABIT contract, the union. But people outside those areas were considered management. And so we were on a salary. And so we never got overtime, and time off was at the discretion of the bureau chief. So if you worked Saturday and Sunday, I always got those days back. But if I worked 24 hours in one day, I never got the other 16 hours back.
So a lot of our listeners are not in TV, and they're always telling me, what goes on behind the scenes. I don't want to see how the sausage is made. The role of a producer, because you're talking about getting the story, getting the lead story, your team going out there. What does each person do, and how do you work together? If that's not too big of a question.
No, it was back then. It was interesting because we had a photographer, a sound tech, producer, and a correspondent. And so on the big stories, we would all work together. We'd have to rent one of those big Lincoln Continentals because that's the only thing that could fit 4 men at that time and their equipment. So we traveled a lot together, the full crew. That was a full complement. A lot of times as a producer, I would find stories. I would go out and do most of the work. I'd set up the story. I'd do the interviews. I would outline it. I'd work with the crew. Then the correspondent would come in for the big interview and the stand-up. And that's essentially how it worked on a lot of enterprise stories and feature stories. On the big stories, the breaking stories, we all went together as a crew of 4. And let's say, for example, there was a big story like in El Paso. We'd fly to El Paso and we would get a rent-a-car. And of course, this is before GPS and the internet and smartphones and or cell phones. I mean, we couldn't communicate unless it was a payphone. And we would go into a town, we'd rent a car, we'd try to find our way to wherever the story was. We would work a lot with the local affiliates. We would shoot our part of the story, the interviews, the stand-ups. We get the atmosphere with the photography. And then we'd have to find our way to the TV station to put the story together. In the meantime, our editor would fly in from Houston with his equipment. And so then we had a crew of 5. And so we'd come back to the station, say, or a hotel room around 3:00. The editor would be set up. We would start writing and editing the story. But before we did that, we had to send the script off to New York so they could review it and make their changes. And so we had this safety system, people looking over our shoulder, which sometimes we didn't appreciate. but it kept us from making mistakes and sometimes made the story better. So they would send in the rewrites, and this is before computers. So we literally had scissors and tape, and we'd copy and paste, but physically, manually. And we put together the story, and we would Xerox it so everybody would have a copy. The correspondent would record the track with the editor. Then we'd start editing. And our newscast was at 5:30 local time, Central Time, 6:30 in New York. And so we'd have to feed 30 minutes before. And while we're feeding, everybody else was feeding in from across the country too. And we had to go through central control room, and you hear all these voices from around the different parts of the country feeding their stories in. And so we had to feed it, and they would look at it, and sometimes they go, well, the audio's too low or the video's too high, refeed it. And so it was heart pounding because we're in the middle of nowhere. So sometimes cities we've never been to, we're feeding in tight deadline, and the stories had to be 1:45, give or take 2 seconds. And if you're over that, you had to cut, or if you're under that, you had to add. So there's always that type of pressure too. So sometimes we'd feed with about 15 minutes to the newscast, and that was really close. And that was like on every breaking story, that was the scenario.
That's a lot of pressure every day, day after day. I got a question about writing. Now, I'm guessing that it would differ sometimes with different correspondents. In some cases, a producer would basically write most of it, and I'm guessing in some cases the correspondent themselves would write, and often it was a collaboration. What was your experience with that?
On the breaking news stories, the correspondent would take the lead, and then it would become a collaboration. We would go back and forth with him or her, me and we would look over the script and say, well, we need to add this, we need to change this. We'd go back and forth. And then we'd send it to New York. They put their 2 cents in. On feature stories, enterprise stories, a lot of times I would write the outline or write I would find the sound bites, and then I'd write a paragraph into that sound bite. And so it was truly a collaboration. I'm not sure how it's done these days, but back then it was part of being a professional. Everybody is on equal plane here. When you're out in the field, photographers and sound and our crews, so photographers and sound techs, they had their say as well. And so it was a true collaboration. And if you had a tight working group, it really made the difference in the story.
Okay, again, tell us how long you did that network staff gig.
I did that for 4 years, and then you guys have been through this corporate restructuring. So
yeah.
I was there about 4 years, and General Electric bought NBC, and these were a bunch of bean counters, and they started slashing, and our bureau was the first, and I think 10 people lost their jobs, and they wanted everybody to come back as freelancers, so that way they wouldn't have to pay us vacation time, pension, holiday pay.
Right, you're not on the books.
Yeah,
there's
so
no head count on the books.
That exactly, and so they expect you to come back and work for them as a freelancer, and they would make all this money. And so that's what NBC did. So they crashed the bureau. Then they started going around the country, cutting other bureaus as well, and just decimated the workforce. So that's at that point I went freelance. And, I really like the people of Houston, but Houston's a long way down there. And I had a lot of friends in Dallas. So I said, I'm moving to Dallas. And so I moved to Dallas and became a freelancer out there for 20 years.
And in that case, then you would work for anybody. You might work for ABC, NBC, CBS, anybody, right?
Exactly. And I picked up a lot of work with ABC. I never worked for NBC Network again. They call me, I'd say, no, I'm not available. Because I'm not going to work cheap, and they would try to hire me back when I was in Dallas, but they wanted me to do 2 jobs for less pay. I said, I'm not doing it. And so I went freelance. I worked a lot with ABC. I still did the network, and I covered the Oklahoma City bombing. I covered the big stories. And then I found some foreign clients, a German TV client called Satines out of DC. They worked me a lot. They sent me all around the country. I did some work with PBS, KERA. I did a lot of work with WFAA in Dallas. And so it was wherever the work was. And so as a freelancer is a whole different game. You have to get your name out there. You have to pitch the story. You have to have someone buy it. You have to go out and do the story. Then you have to collect the money. And so it was a long process, but being a freelancer exposed me to so many different things than I would if I had stayed with one network. I mean, I got to travel the whole world basically, and I got to do all different types of work. When I was working with WFAA, they had this show called Primetime Texas, and so this was like an hour during prime time. And so they said, Steve, you go out and do stories that you want to do. And I did. I was able to do 8, 9, 10-minute pieces, like on Michael Nesmith of the Monkees, or the Southern Baptist schism. I mean, all these different stories that I loved. I was come up with these different stories, and I don't know where else I could have got that freedom. And then I had former colleagues who worked in New York, and they would fly me up to work on special projects. Like WNBC in New York. So I was able to work a lot with the longtime anchor Chuck Scarborough, and we went to several countries doing stories. And so being a freelancer exposed you to so many different things, and working for one client or one a network or one TV station. So it's a tough life. It's not something that's conducive to family life or home life. But as someone who's dedicated in journalism, it suited me, and I was very happy doing it.
Did you ever pick up any of the true crime documentaries or any of that stuff? I know.
I did. I worked for something called On the Case with Paul Lazan. It was the first season. So I moved to New York, and so I did this true crime thing. I was under a different impression when I moved up there. It's for investigative discovery. And I thought we'd actually be doing investigations. Silly me. Basically, I call it, what's a good word? I call it like murder porn, because someone always is murdered, and it's usually a woman who's wronged by a man, and that was the theme. And not only that show, for across a broad spectrum of Discovery ID programming, Lifetime, and all these other channels, it's just something that is predominantly female viewers. But that was a formula that worked for years. And so I did that for a year, and I had a couple of interesting documentaries I produced. But it wasn't for me. I just didn't really fit into that system. I didn't consider it to be much journalism. It was storytelling, but it wasn't like, exposing someone who's on death row who didn't commit the crime.
No, they're just entertainment shows, basically.
Yeah, they are, and in fact, you had to go by the same rules as other entertainment shows, which means sign releases and this sort of thing. Whereas as news and true documentaries, you don't have to worry about that. But since this was considered entertainment, then you had to play those entertainment rules.
Well, what about reality shows now? I know some freelance producers end up working on some of those too. Did you ever do any of that?
I did a couple, and as on a freelance basis. Never quite caught on. I call it. It's a lot of it's contrived, and so I never really ventured in that field very much. I dipped my toe in it, and it paid the groceries from time to time, but I just didn't like it. I didn't pursue it. I also had the chance once, and only once, to work for with Bill O'Reilly's show. The name escapes me now, but Inside Edition. Yeah, there we go. And I did it once, and a friend of mine's a photographer says, "We need a producer. Can you help out?" I said, "Sure." So I was wondering what this is all about. So we did the story. You may remember this. This is of the Friday night football cat burglar. During Friday night, someone would steal everybody's TVs and stereo systems, because this burglar knew that these people would be at the football game on Friday night, because it was Texas. Except for one time he did this, and someone didn't go to the game. They shot him dead. And so this guy was like an insurance salesman, former Boy Scout master, and he needed the money initially. Then I think he got hooked on the adrenaline. So we're interviewing the widow, who claimed that she'd had no idea what was going on. And so the correspondent, we're doing this interview, but before we did the interview, she was there with her minister, and she insisted on more money before she did the interview. So the correspondent handed the phone to them and said, "Here's my producer in Los Angeles. You negotiate." So they negotiated some amount, could be $2,000 or $3,000. And so we're doing the interview, and at one point the correspondent stops the interview. He says, "Look, lady, we're paying you a lot of money. We want to hear some emotion. We want to see some tears."
Wow.
Okay, roll, Bill.
Well, that's Inside Edition, hard copy, that kind of stuff. Generally, the network 2020 and those kind, they do not pay for interviews. That is like a no-no in the journalism world. But yeah, that Inside Edition, hard copy, that's a different animal.
Because you got to feed the beast.
That's right, and you got competition out there, and at that time was hard copy, and but that was the game they played. So I did that once. I got that experience, and I said, "No, I don't want to do this. This is not journalism."
So news is in your blood, and adventure. And I know you did a lot of stuff overseas. The German company. I watched one of your videos, and the German guy said he loved you. Everybody loved you, but he had one problem with you. You never learned German.
And never will.
Except for bitte ein Bier. So what kind of stories did you do overseas?
Well, for the Germans, it was national. We did some really good documentaries. We did a documentary on Scientology before that story really broke big. This was like around 1999 or 2000. And it was a really good documentary about what this alleged religion really was. It was an amazing story. I had a little exposure to Scientology before we did it, and I learned a lot. So they guaranteed me that if I worked on this story, this documentary, that they provide a lawyer in case I got sued, because Scientology is very litigious. And so we did this like an hour, because they were trying to get a religious exemption in Germany, and Germans know a thing or two about cults, and they weren't giving it to them. And so that was the angle of the story. What is this group? So we did that. We did weapons of mass destruction before that was really big. So the Germans gave me a lot of, they sent me all over the country to do a lot of good journalism. And they had really good journalistic ethics. And I really enjoyed working with them very much. As far as overseas, I did a lot with WNBC in New York. And back, I don't know if they still do it, but the sweep period where you get the ratings in May and October, and they set the rates, advertising rate for the rest of the year. I would go to New York for the sweeps in May and October, and I worked a lot with Chuck Scarborough, and we went to the Turkey earthquakes. We went to Vietnam looking for the remains of missing American servicemen. We went to Mexico to do something about how produce is what kind of pesticides they use and herbicides. So we did a lot of work. And my favorite story overseas was we followed two American soldiers to meet with the German tank gunner they fought against in the Battle of the Bulge. That was one of my favorite stories.
Wow.
And so so you're in Vietnam in the jungles looking for the remains of American servicemen, and then all of a sudden you're in Belgium in the battlefield where these men fought against each other, and the foxholes are still there. I mean, where else can you go see this type of thing other than journalism? So I traveled overseas a lot for a while, maybe a dozen countries, and then I worked for a while with Channel 11 after the 9/11 bombing.
CBS 11
crash in the building. CBS 11, and Linda Levy was news director, and I worked with her at Channel 8 for a while on Primetime Texas. And so after the planes went into the tower, I got calls from New York, Washington, and Dallas. Wanted me to work. And so I was thinking about going up to New York, and Linda says, "Well, if you work here, I'll send you overseas." And I said, "Deal." And so I don't know where they wouldn't do this now. I mean, corporate America would not do this now. But I went down to the Philippines for 2 weeks doing stories. I was in Pakistan. I was in Germany, and so I was doing some really good work that they paid for. And so that was the extent of my worldwide coverage until the Iraq War. And then again, Channel 11. This time, John Miller's news director wanted me to go and be the producer with Robert Riggs and Billy Sexton to cover the war. So, different TV stations, different foreign networks. I got a lot of experience, and I'm so happy that I was able to go overseas and do stories, because you always kind of wonder, what's that like? This is on my bucket list. People have different bucket lists. Excuse me. Mine was like, cover presidential campaigns and going overseas and covering the war. And so I got the opportunity to do all that.
So what kind of stories did you do covering the war? Like, give me some idea. And
Well,
we're calling that the golden age of TV because there's no money to do that anymore.
Yeah, I know. And back then, as you know, Rich, you got Brian, the TV stations, especially had a good news director. You want to keep your local audience informed. You want to rely somebody in New York or Los Angeles tell them what the story is. They want local people to do the story. And unfortunately, it's not that way now. So they sent us to cover the Iraq War, and Riggs got us in with the Patriot Missile Battalion. And we were right behind the Marine Corps, which was clearing the way. So we spent 2 months in the desert, camping out basically. And we followed this unit in from El Paso, Texas. And so what we would do is like the lives of ordinary soldiers. What do you do day by day? And then all of a sudden we'd do like, what's the strategy? How does this weaponry system work? If you remember the first Iraq War under George H. Bush, the Patriot missiles did not work. They initially reported they had this great success rate, but they didn't. And so now Raytheon, they put like $1 billion, $2 billion back in this program to refine the system. And we were there to see if it worked too, which it did for the most part. So we did that. That's the type of stories we did. Then once the invasion started, we were in a Humvee for several weeks following the Patriot Missile Battalion around, because the Marines would clear the way. The Patriots would set up their defense system, and they would protect frontline assets like soldiers and equipment. And so we were part of that group, and we thought, well, it's a Patriot Missile Battalion. Everything's gonna be nice and cool, But that wasn't the case. In war, many things happen. What they call it, the fog of war.
Right.
And this was a really confusing time because this was not a well-planned invasion. So it became a tragedy for a lot of people in our group because people were murdered and ambushed, and these were like everyday grunts who weren't trained to necessarily be like the Marine fighters of the front line. They were attacked, and they killed several of them. One was kidnapped, abducted, or whatever you want to call it, taken prisoner of war. Jessica Lynch, Private Jessica Lynch from our group.
Oh, absolutely.
She was from your group?
Yeah, she was a part of the maintenance division of the Patriots. And we had profiled her in El Paso before the war started.
Wow.
And just a sweet thing, young, somewhat innocent. And so she was part of our group. And so I said the invasion wasn't planned well. So we're going through the desert. And you have to imagine this. There are no roads in the desert. There's supposed to be signs for the troops. There were a lot of times the signs weren't missing. Communications from car to car, unit to unit was sporadic at best. And we're just traveling through the desert. And at one point, I pulled over the Humvee. We had this Humvee that the sergeant major commandeered for us. We had our own Humvee. And I pulled over. I said, Billy, we need to get a shot of this. When you look back at night, and you're nothing but thousands of headlights going in like in these all over the desert. I don't know where they're following us. We were following somebody else. That's all I knew. But it was like this surreal scene. And, this was the invasion. And I'm thinking like, man, if Saddam had some weapons, we'd all be dead, because we're sitting ducks out here in the desert.
No
cover. And that's how we invaded, driving the desert.
This has been a fascinating look. I want to go back a little bit. First of all, you talked about this is really tough on your home life to be traveling that much all the time. That was one of the things I always thought. I wanted to be a network correspondent, but I kind of got a better deal where I didn't have to cover the pig plant that was exploding in Arkansas somewhere, ruined my weekend. I just got to cover the big stories. But living on the road all the time like that, working those kind of hours, that must have taken a toll on you physically, emotionally, in every other way.
Yeah, and sometimes at the time you didn't recognize it, because that's just part of your life. It wasn't conducive to my love life, I'll tell you that. I missed some Thanksgivings and Christmases and birthdays and other holidays. But this is something that you did. But you would wake up in a different hotel room like every night, and we were all in this together. I had a great crews to work with, and so it's like our family on the road. One of the photographers I worked with at NBC. He was a photographer that working for NBC who filmed Jack Ruby killing Oswald. That's one my photographer. So you're working with these great people, with all this experience. He covered the civil rights movements. And so it's fun to go on the road because you hear these stories. But, so you would work really hard, and afterwards you had to have some release. And so back then we tended to smoke and drink a lot. I don't think they do that anymore. I know I don't, but that was how you got your release. And so, and then you'd wake up the next day and do it all over again. I remember once I woke up, I said, God, I wish I was home. And I'm looking around, and I was home. I didn't even know it. And so that's how disoriented you get.
Okay, one other clarification, and this has been fascinating, Steve. It really has been a look behind the scenes, even for me and Bryan. I think we know a lot about what you did, but some of this is a real revelation. But when you were freelancing, there were times where you had to pitch your stories. You had to come up with stories and pitch. It wasn't they were calling you, say, we need you to go down and cover this explosion or whatever. How often did that happen where you were actually pitching stories?
I did that all the time. I'd call up ABC, I'd call up CBS, and I'd call up WNBC, I'd call up my German client, and you just kind of come up with some stories on your own, and then you start pitching them. And that was a constant process. And a lot of times I was successful. And other times they said, nah, that doesn't interest us. That's not for us. But it was really kind of frustrating, that process, because you didn't know, where your next job was going to come from. But, you knew that going into the business as a freelancer. But on the other hand, you got I got some good stories on the air. I mean, when 9/11 happened, Linda Levy says, would you come to work for us? And she says, what stories do you want to do? I said, oh, God, now I got to come up with something. And so that's how I ended up in the Philippines covering a couple of stories. And that happened a lot with other clients as well. And they say, hey, that's a good idea. Go ahead and do a good story. So you don't get that opportunity very often if you work with the same employer day after day.
So what stories were you covering in the Philippines? How did you get to the Philippines from CBS 11?
They had, crew. Well, I was also with them in Pakistan and Germany, but they wanted international coverage because their viewers, they want to know. We want to have local people doing it. So I was curious about this. There was a terrorist cell in the Philippines in the 90s that the FBI doesn't like to acknowledge, but that's where they came up with the game plan for 9/11. And so I did some research, and before the internet, you go to LexisNexis, which is still a great resource. And I started reading all these newspapers in the Philippines and talking from the 90s, and they were talking about this terrorist cell. And I think they busted this terrorist cell because they were making bombs, and bomb making got out of hand and blew up a building, and that's when they busted this terrorist cell. And that terrorist cell, in that terrorist cell was Ramzi Youssef, the first World Trade Center bomber. So the more I read about this, the more I started seeing like this could be a connection to 9/11. So I did a lot of research. I got a local fixer down there to kind of show us around. I went down there with Andrew Benazzi, former chief photographer, Channel 11, and we spent 2 weeks down there. We turned like 4 stories over 2 weeks. So I interviewed the former national police chief and an investigator who had busted this cell, and they'd gotten interviews, and when they confessed, I'm not sure how they got those confessions. It could have been forced. It could have been voluntary. But they had it on paper saying that they were taking flying lessons and they were learning how to fly planes into American monuments. That was in 1995.
Wow.
And that information was turned over to the FBI, and the FBI denies that that information was given to them. And so about 10 years ago, the History Channel did 2 hours on that angle, and I had it first. That was one of the stories I did. Second story was, what was Terry Nichols, one of the young Oklahoma City bombers, doing down there in that same time period? And there were some undercover agents that tied Terry Nichols to this terrorist cell who claimed that he was trying to learn how to make a bomb. And so Terry Nichols married a local girl, who was already pregnant with another man's baby. And he kept going back down there with her. And then right when this terrorist cell was busted, he came back to the United States and never went back. So I'm not saying there's concrete proof that's where he learned to make the bomb, but it's awfully suspicious, and it turned into a good story.
Right. That's I don't believe in coincidences. And we can certainly get into conspiracy or connect dots and all that kind of stuff, but it sounds like the kind of stories you're doing, it's just sent chills up my spine, especially the 9/11 thing. We knew they were taking flying lessons in 95. What kind of awards did you win for all this stuff? Or did you?
I'm not sure I put in for anything. I was just glad to do the story and get a paycheck.
Yeah.
Right, because you can't win the award unless you apply for the award.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't do that. I just turned those stories in and on to the next one. I mean, later on, I did some of that, but it was just, I hate to say fun, but it was fun just doing those stories and just fascinating. I mean, how often do you get a chance to go to the Philippines, then end up in the southern part of the Philippines, doing a story with the Navy SEALs tracking down a terrorist group? I mean, it was just fascinating work. So the awards part came off and on throughout my career. I was recognized a couple of years ago in the Golden Circle Award for the Emmys for lifetime contributions, which was really nice.
Yes.
But awards never was part of my repertoire. I just enjoyed the business so much, and if I got a paycheck, I was a happy guy.
You had the curiosity. You did investigations. It was in your blood and that adrenaline and just finding out things. That's crazy.
Well, and I want to ask you now, are you retired now, and did you stay freelance the rest of your career?
After I worked for the Paul Lozon show, I got hired by America's Most Wanted as a supervising producer. I was one of two supervising producers. The other guy handled the reenactments, the recreations. I handled the journalism part, the documentary part of the show. And I really like working with those guys because you were not only doing journalism, but something became of that journalism where a bad guy was arrested. So I love that part of the job. Didn't too much like being a supervisor. We had a staff of about maybe 75 to 100, maybe 80 people. That part wasn't the fun part, but it was great putting together stories and seeing a result at the end of the day, which you don't see very often. And also we had like 6 million viewers. That lasted a year because Fox canceled the show. So then I went back in the freelance world again, working out of Washington, D.C. And I worked with, like a lot of the German networks. I love those guys. And plus, I had some corporate clients as well at that point. But, you guys, this, if you're trained in journalism, you're trained in video and broadcasting, you could do a lot of different things. You just don't have to do news. And so with that training that I had in news, I could also go out and do corporate videos. I could do political commercials. I can do soft feature documentaries. And so journalism is such a good trainer for other careers as well, communications, advertising, public relations, all that. So when I delved in that a little bit off and on in my career when I'm freelancing, but that helped pay the bills as well. So I stayed freelance until one day in Washington, D.C., I said, it's awfully expensive and awfully crowded up here, and I love the city, but I'd rather be someplace else. So I decided to move my home state of Arkansas. I moved to Fayetteville and the University of Arkansas. That's where I graduated from. And I did a couple of documentaries when I was there, when I first 2 or 3 years. So I still had my hand in the business. And then I started teaching. And so I'm teaching hopefully the next generation of journalists, whatever shape and form that's going to take. But I'm teaching. Next semester will be my 6th year.
Wow. We have 2 professors on this show today. Mr. Lochhead is at SMU and UNT, and you're at Arkansas. That's awesome.
We're influencing young minds there, Steve.
Bryan and I talked about this before, and that's great because, Bryan, we have so much, and Rich, you do too, to give back to what we've learned. And in academia, so many times it's like, who's got the master's degree and who's got the doctorate degree. And so it's like, now we have the experience. We have a post doctorate. We know how this is done. And Bryan, you may have the same experience. I think the students really appreciate that. That's not something they get from every other professor.
They don't. It's not just theoretical. It's real world stuff. And
I will say this too. There's been a recurring theme on this podcast when we talk to people about so many have taken the skills they learned as journalists, the ability to keep 10 balls in the air at the same time, to work under pressure, to meet deadlines, to write and produce and video, put things together that people are interested in. They take those skills, and there's so many things they can do with them. And I don't think there's talk about being, tried by fire in the business you were in, especially that constant deadlight pressure every day, all the time. Builds men and women.
Well, it also builds bad habits because you don't want to do anything until the deadline's approaching. You don't want to work ahead.
Yeah, you need that pressure. And I was starting to sweat when you were talking about feeding from El Paso up to the deadline. The audio's low. You need to redo it. You need to refeed again. I can't seem to recreate that in the classroom. I'm trying to recreate.
Well, my buddy Bob Elliott says, gosh, I wish we had like these heart monitors that hook up to us. We got 30 minutes before the deadline. And we had one producer in D.C. I don't mean to make light of this, but he had to recut the story like 2 or 3 times. The deadline was beating down on him. And someone turns around and says, what do we want to do next, Bill? They turn around and he's like dead on the couch of a heart attack.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my word.
So that does happen. And on the campaign trail, I think CBS lost a photographer. And so it takes a toll on your health. But that deadline, is something that I don't know if you ever get used to it. You just know how to handle it. So it won't handle you. Does that make sense?
Hey, that's a good one. Yep. So it doesn't handle you.
Let me circle back to something before I forget. When I was in the desert, we had a convoy that was attacked, and Jessica Lynch was abducted, and we had like 7 of our group killed. And these were people who were just, they were not frontline soldiers; they were just maintenance people. But also on this Patriot missile, they had these like battle wagons, and that's where they had a young, like a lieutenant or a technical officer. Looking at a radar screen, trying to determine when to fire a missile. And our group of Patriot missiles, we took down an American jet and we took down a British jet, and killed, of course, the pilots. And because they didn't know what they were looking at, these radar screens. And when we first got to camp, we had total access. And the commanding officer said, these guys are with us, answer all their questions, no censorship. And so it's amazing considering today's atmosphere. But they took us in the battle wagon. These technicians going, well, look at all these little things on it. They could be an incoming missile. They could be an American jet or British jet, or there could be phantom objects. So that part of the overhaul of the Patriot missile was not refined as it should have been. And they didn't have communications. They couldn't all of a sudden call up somebody and say, what am I looking at here? You guys got a jet up? Because of that, that's why we lost, 2 planes, 2 jets. And so we did a story on that, and the military was not happy. And eventually that story was picked up by 60 Minutes. And Raytheon because Raytheon, no, it's not our problem. It was the guy in the battle wagon, this young soldier, which was not the case. It was, they didn't develop the system as foolproof, and the Army didn't have the communications it should. So we pulled some good stories out of that.
Yeah, I was going to say in the first Gulf War, the Patriot missile teams were hailed as heroes when they came back, and they had touted their successes and everything. And then I was involved, and I'm sure you might have been too, in the stories that came afterward when they really looked at the Patriot missiles. They didn't work in that first one. And people didn't want to hear that. They were angry at the fact that we were reporting those things. And that's where the thick skin has to come in, because especially in today's world, people don't want the truth. They want the news to reflect this is me getting on my soapbox here. They want to hear what they want to hear. They don't want to hear the truth. So it makes it tougher to do news these days.
Yeah, and I teach that in my classroom. Brian may do the same thing. It's confirmation bias. I'm going to go to the network that reaffirms what I already believe. And anything that's contrary to that, then you're fake news. It's something that media deals with every day. I'm trying to educate my classes about the difference, and getting back to saying, like, don't give people what they want, give them what they need. But I don't know if you can change minds these days. It's getting tougher and tougher. I can't even imagine being out in the trenches these days, working against those circumstances. I covered, as you know, many, many stories. And the last breaking story I covered was Hurricane Harvey in Houston. And I went down there, and for the first time, I noticed people were apprehensive to talk to me, to talk to the media. I'm talking about first responders. I'm talking about this group called the Cajun Navy, who, got their swamp boats and went out and rescued people, and ordinary people, because the well has been poisoned. And I don't know if that can be reversed or not.
Yeah, that's a subject for another podcast, but this has been fascinating, man. So is that what you're doing now? You're teaching and sort of semi-retired, or is it full-time teaching?
I can't, I have to be doing something now. But I'm not even semi-retired. Let's just say I'm teaching, and I also do, I judge these national awards, Mark Hom and Hermes, for my old buddy Ed Dalheim, who he also used to work at Channel 4 years ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a blast from the past.
Yeah,
Ed's still here in Fort Worth somewhere, right?
Yeah, he's part of that the Arco-American group as well. But I'm still doing some work with Ed, I get to judge documentaries and news stories and radio broadcasts and podcasts and things like that. And then I teach. And so I don't teach full time, because if I did, then I'd have to go to committee hearings and meetings, things like that.
Brian has told me the same story.
I've told Richard the same story. And I don't know if you remember a guy named John Sparks.
Oh, of course. Yes.
Well, we've had him on the podcast, and he and I are friends, and we've followed each other in our careers. He worked at Channel 4. I worked at Channel 4. He went to 11. I went to 11. I mean, he went to UNT to teach. He got me up there to teach. We just followed each other. But his advice when I was going to start teaching was just try not to be full time, because then you got to do all the committee. Go to all the committees.
and then you got to have to teach what they tell you to teach. I mean, the classes. So
right.
You're right, Brian. I teach 3 classes. So if I steer clear of that 4th class.
Right. 4th class, then we have you now. But it's interesting. I'll tell a quick story, because it happened yesterday in class. I gave them an assignment to shoot a sequence, just something simple, right? And as they were doing it in class, I said, it's due at the end of class. And the clock was ticking. And there was one girl there. And I said, you want to know how it feels like in the real world? Are you almost done? Are you almost done? You have five minutes. How long? And she goes, you're making me really nervous. I go, that's what I'm trying to do.
or have a news director look over his shoulder and say, you're not going to put that in the script, are you?
All those stories. And last thing for me, I worked for John Miller at Channel 11. So you and I were probably there at the same time. And Billy Sexton actually hired me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Such a great guy. Again, is such a consummate pro.
Yeah, he really is. And I ran into Robert Riggs a few times in the Dallas Bureau, but, so we kind of crossed paths there. But
it's a small world. That's why you have to be careful.
That's right. And through your career, you didn't burn any bridges, or you wouldn't have been as successful as you were.
I only burned those bridges that needed to be burned. I'm glad I did. I will never work with those people again. Hey, I worked with Sparks. Sparks was in the WNBC too. When I was up there doing these road trips with Chuck Scarborough, he was up there as head of, I think, special projects.
Yeah, we had Sparky on, and that was a revelation. We didn't even know he'd been in New York working there during 9/11 and all that other stuff. This show has been wonderful to reconnect with guys like you, to hear stories we've never heard, fascinating stories. This has been a great podcast episode. And again, Steve, thanks for being on with us.
And I appreciate you taking time out of your vacation to do this. Next time we'll do it on video, because I would like to narrow it down and really dig into some of the stories you did. And we kind of glossed over your early experience at Channel 4 in Arkansas, which I know was really influential for you.
Yeah. We'll have you back. If you'll come back, we'd love to have you back.
I would love that. And this has been so much fun and so good to reconnect with you guys.